Hello everybody, this is Mithril Zenith, and today I wanted to talk about the idea of never just one problem, as it pertains to Fire Emblem and as it pertains to one weapon in particular, the Javelin. Never just one problem generally means that you're, as a player, faced with multiple different issues, which each require their own different type of solution, and so you're asked to provide multiple answers for these different problems. The Javelin is somewhat of the inverse of that. It is the multi-tool solution to almost every problem you will face in Fire Emblem. Now, there are some issues that can't be solved with the Javelin, and in this case I'm saying Javelin, Hand Axe, Wind Edge even to a lesser extent, the 1-2 range weapons in Fates to a lesser extent as well, and I'll get into that as to why. But the idea of the Javelin being the multi-tool, being the solution, really comes to a head in the Game Boy Advanced games. The Javelin is a 1-2 range weapon. It's usable by some of the best, strongest unit types in the game, Cavaliers, also Generals, also Wyvern Knights, Pegasus Knights. It's usable by all of the best kind of general statted units in the game. It's 1-2 range, so it can attack in melee and at 2 range. It's decently accurate, it's decently cheap, decently available. Not terrible damage, somewhat decent damage, but not terrible weight either. And because of all of these factors, being easily accessible, being easy to use, it's generally D rank. Hand Axe is even easier with E rank. You're almost always going to have one available. With a sufficiently strong unit, the Javelin becomes the answer to every problem. Here's the issue with the Javelin. If you have a unit that's strong enough to answer every problem with a Javelin, then the Javelin becomes the answer to every problem, and then all you need is just a stack of Javelins in your inventory, and you're able to solve whatever situation you come across. Just look at my Seth solo run for proof of that. On one hand, that is definitely the fault of the units in question being able to be so overpowered, but on the other hand, it just kind of becomes the default best weapon choice, even if you can't, like one-man army, an entire enemy army, you still want a Javelin or a Hand Axe or 1-2 range available to you like that. There are other 1-2 range options in the game, there are other 1 range options, 2 range options, which are better in different ways, but the Javelin is kind of this pivot point of the game, where once you understand how good it is, how powerful it is, how strong it is, how brokenly powerful it is in a lot of ways, how much it breaks the game, you then stop seeing Fire Emblem as a game, like, it's not that you stop seeing Fire Emblem as a game of a lot of, multiple problems and multiple solutions, but you begin to see it as, what can I solve with a Javelin versus what do I have to use something else for? Let's go over the Javelin a little bit in some of the games, see what I mean. Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, Javelin's not too strong, but generally because the units are so weak, you can't solve everything with a Javelin. It's low hit rate. Gaiden, same thing as well, kind of iffy hit rate. Most of these games suffer just from lower hit rates in general. Mystery of the Emblem, you see 20 weight on the Javelin, that's a balancing factor you'll see later. Genealogy of the Holy War, 18 weight. I think Javelins are pretty rare actually as well for player units. Thracia 776, 50 hit, 12 weight. That's also Thracia though. Binding Blade, 11 weight, 55 hit. Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones, 65 hit. This is kind of when it really got standardized, what the Javelin did. Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, pretty similar. Shadow Dragon, back up to close to what it was initially. new mystery of the Emblem, they started getting rid of weapon weight. Awakening, even more accurate, but Awakening has its different issues. Fates, you have all of this text here. They saw that the Javelin was a problem, they decided it can't follow up, you can't crit, you can't use offensive skills, and it's extra slow in a game with no weapon weight. They knew the Javelin was a problem by that point in time. Then it comes back for Echoes, where it's pretty weak. You can forge it up in Echoes to up to 8 might and 1 weight. And then 3 houses, quite weak, but not terrible. And you can upgrade it slightly as well. And 3 hopes doesn't really matter. It is a spinoff. So, why the issues with the Javelin? Let's take a look at some of the other 1 to 2 range weapons in the game. You have tomes, first of all. Tomes have varied wildly in their power level. Mages in general have varied wildly on their power level through the series, but in general, mages tend to be more squishy, more vulnerable. Their spells tend to be a lot more have a lot more variance in how effective they are. Against some units, they're going to do a lot, but against some units, they're not going to do much at all. Technically, you could say the same thing for javelins, but units that use javelins tend to have high enough strength that it doesn't matter what the enemy has unless they have a really huge defense, like a general or something. Hand axes have the same sort of issue as the javelins. They're generally a little less accurate, but a little more powerful, weigh a little bit more, usable by a wider variety of units, generally the ones that have higher strength. What other 1-2 range options are there? Occasional legendary weapons, some other lances, spear, short spear. Those are generally rarer. They would be amazing if you had access to them more often, but because you generally only get 1 or 2 in the game, they're not that great. There's not a whole lot of other 1-2 range options in the game. The only real exception is in Radiant Dawn. You have Wind Edge, Storm Sword, and Tempest Blade. And in Fates, where you have every base weapon type gets a 1-2 range version with these restrictions. So why is the Javelin specifically so much of an issue? It's because it allows one unit to do everything. In most of the games it shows up, in most of the games it's prominent in. Everyone knows something like Seth, or FE7 Marcus, or a well-trained Christmas Cavalier who's promoted. Just give them a stack of javelins and they'll be able to power through the game. There's a reason why so many sword-locked, foot-locked units are just called sword-lock, foot-lock, D rank, D tier. And people don't give them the time of day. It's because they can't use javelins. Why is that such a big deal? It's because javelins are so format warping for the game. Is that having that 1-2 range access is so powerful. Why? Well, the game tries to throw a lot of various enemy types at you. Enemy units with 1-2 range, for an example, some hand axes and javelins of their own, but also generally a mix of 1 range units, soldiers, knights, cavaliers, and 2 range units, nomads, archers, some mages. If one unit with 1 weapon is able to deal with all of these unit types at the same time, that game becomes an enemy phase type game, where you just sit in their range, make sure you're strong enough to take all their hits, and kill them all in enemy phase with a javelin. That means that units that are strong enough, that can get strong quickly, and can use javelins are a lot more powerful. Otherwise, in games where that's not the case, in games that are more player phase focused, either because the enemies are significantly stronger, or the 1-2 range options are significantly weaker or less accurate, you start seeing more uses for units like mages, units like archers, dedicated 2 range, units like swordmasters, dedicated boss killers, you start seeing more variety of these units. You start seeing more uses for them as javelins get weaker. But in games where javelins are strong and javelins are prominent, you're not really going to see that much. For instance, Shadow Dragon is a perfect example. There may or may not be as many good uses for like a Myrmidon, Navarre, but you're gonna have uses for effective weaponry. Granted, effective weaponry is really tilted in that game, so that's a little bit much, maybe a bad example. But archers, maybe New Mystery of the Emblem is a better example. Archers are so useful in that game. One, because there's a lot of Draco Knights and whatnot that you fight early on, but two, because having accurate 2 range, being able to chip enemies down and then finish them off is very important, especially if you're playing Lunatic Reverse, where if the enemy can counter you, they'll hit you first no matter what. Accurate 2 range. Javelins and hand axes aren't accurate enough in that game to make up the difference. They aren't powerful enough to make up the difference. You see in a game like Blazing Blade or the Sacred Stones, though, if a unit can have a javelin or a hand axe, they're gonna be the best unit, at least like a solid tier above any other comparable units, just because of that easy 1-2 range access. Binding Blade is a little bit of an interesting point to this, because early on, javelins and hand axes are so inaccurate that you're not going to have great hit rates using them, but you also don't have great hit rates using most things. But later in the game, when your units are strong enough and start overpowering enemies, then your javelins and hand axes become infinitely useful, as you're able to just use them to mow through lines of enemies. Though that said, nothing really beats Air Caliber on like a Lu teleported into a mountain or something. So yeah, what do I think Engage is going to do with javelins? I really don't know. Do I think it needs to go the Fates route of severely nerfing them and making them almost unusable? No, I don't necessarily think that's required. But I do think that if you take javelins seriously, give them the attention and balancing they deserve, you end up with a much better game, a much more well-rounded and diverse game that ends up seeing a lot more play of various units than it does just consolidation into, 2 or 3 obvious top tiers who just use 1-2 range and steamroll the game. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. I'll leave you to consider what javelins and hand axes have done to Fire Emblem in the comments down below. Sub to the channel if you enjoyed this little chat. Until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.